So we'll try to not bore everyone with PowerPoint. So first, I have a quick admission to make. I run a thermal power company. So we build and maintain and upgrade coal-fired power stations all across India. And I don't know if that means that you guys are not interested to hear me talk for 5 or 8 minutes, but I want to try to make a point that our thermal sector is incredibly relevant as we transition to a completely different energy ecosystem in India. So, you know, I start that with a little bit about GE. You know, the benefit of working for GE when you think about fuel and power is we're really fuel agnostic. We have technology across really every type of generation as well as transmission and distribution. And we really let these be national decisions where we try to bring best available technology and conceptual leadership to whatever that individual country chooses. So whatever the path of a country takes, we try to partner and impose really what I'll call a technology or a company-centric way onto that market. So I would say I don't wake up in the morning running a thermal power company rooting for renewables not to succeed. Okay, we in every one of our operating plans are 100% convinced that this country will meet its targets with respect to solar, with respect to winds, and with respect to renewables as we look to 2022 and 2027. We don't sort of go home every night from our factories and from our offices hoping that renewables isn't successful. Okay? We firmly believe instead that thermal power has an unbelievable opportunity to enable the success of renewable energy sources both in India and all around the world. So I think that's incredibly important as an outset. Really, I want to talk about 3 things. The first is the reality that our grid and our broadly speaking generation network will face come 2022. If you, like I do, assume that India is going to meet its targets on solar and wind penetration, pretty much there's generally accepted across, whether it's CEA, whether it's our assessments or other companies' assessments, that you're going to need essentially dispatching generation of roughly 80 to 100 gigawatts in a given day. As the sun goes down later on in the afternoon into the early evening, this country will need about 80 gigawatts of dispatchable power to fill the gap, okay, as solar and other renewable sources aren't dispatching. So the question is, how do we solve that problem in the most economic and socially responsible way? So I think there's been some discussion already today about battery. So certainly battery is a really good option. And we certainly believe that over time, the price point and the cost point with respect to battery technology will reach a point where it becomes extremely economic to put into the power system and use as a mechanism to dispatch power at those times of day when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing. So we believe in battery. We do not believe in battery in the near term. Okay, so say 2022, if you use that as a benchmark, we don't believe economically that's really an answer. So then you go to 2 sources which could be very good sources. Gas, which is used predominantly in many places around the world, as well as hydro. We think both of these sources are viable. However, they won't be economically or in some cases environmentally feasible to fill anywhere near the demand in India of 80 plus gigawatts of dispatch need. We expect it to be somewhere around 25. Okay? So you assume 50, 55 gigawatts needs to be filled. And our very clear view is that will be filled by India's existing coal-fired generation stations. Okay? Now, I think what's important to appreciate here is that's not a bad thing. And actually, it can be a very powerful thing for the country and the environment, and I'll show that in a minute. First, we have an enormous amount of subcritical coal-fired power stations in the country that are heavily depreciated. Okay? it's extremely economical to utilize those assets as a bridge to a more sustainable solution to our kind of dispatching challenges like a battery. Okay? So number one, you've got depreciated assets, economically very intelligent to use them versus simply shutting them. It's number one. Number two, the good news is readily available technology, by the way, indigenous technology, inside of India, engineered in India, manufactured in India, can be applied to those plants to make them readily flexible, to take their technical minimum load far below the 55% that exists today across our thermal power stations in India. And when I say far below, I speak to as low as 30%. In some cases, maybe even lower. Okay? So there's readily available technology to make coal plants flexible to meet this need. And that cost of that is less, actually substantially less, than what the government mandates today for emission control equipment for SOx and NOx. Substantially less. Lastly, this gives life to coal plants, and this gives an extended life to about 15 million Indians, more than 1 crore Indians who work in our coal sector, whether that's in manufacturers like GE or BHEL or L&T, whether that's in Coal India, whether that's in Indian Railways, whether that's in all the sub-suppliers that support this sector. This is a huge social part of the fabric of this country, an economic engine for India. Okay? So you have an ability to utilize a depreciated asset. You have an ability to upgrade that asset to be readily flexible, and you do it in a way that I think is very powerful for the country with respect to the social responsibilities that we have in our coal sector. Now, I have one page I want to show you. Now, I'm sure you just flip the page, if you can. Now, all of you work in the renewable sector, I would imagine, in part because you find a great deal of purpose in what it does for the world that we live in and the sustainability of this planet. I assume that's a big part of why you work in the sector. I want to tell you, that's also why I work in the sector. It's also why I'm proud to work in thermal power in this country. And this chart depicts it in an incredibly powerful way, okay? An incredibly powerful way. This is an analysis that's based on the country's national electricity plan, okay? The only variables that we have changed in this analysis that I'm going to walk you through is how you run your coal plants. That's the only variable we've changed. The assumptions of generation, the assumptions of installed capacity by fuel types, straight out of the National Electricity Plan. This assumes all the renewable targets in the country are met. Okay? So, 2022. This red ball depicts the total cost of generation, not transmission or distribution, total cost of generation of all fuels, as well as the amount of CO2 emitted from power generation. This is the red ball. This is the red ball. Now, this is purely the National Electricity Plan, and this assumes we do nothing to change the fact that the coal plants in this country are designed for a technical minimum of 55% load. Okay? Now, what we do is we present some other balls. The first thing we did was we wanted to stress test, what if you used more gas in the country? What would that mean? Because there's a lot of people sometimes say, hey, should we have gas plants? Should we do LNG? So we took these balls in the corner, these yellow balls, the white and yellow and the more gold ball. This assumes, these balls assume if we run that bright yellow ball is if we maximize generation from gas. What you see is when you do that, you have less CO2, but you have a lot more cost. Actually speaking, your cost goes up by about $2.5 billion. Okay? It goes up from $112 billion to about $114.8 billion. Substantial increase if you run gas more. So that's not extremely economical. Okay? So we look at other ideas. So I want to describe these balls. The purple, the blue, and the green. The purple ball assumes you continue to run technical minimum of coal plants at 55%, but you upgrade the plants for efficiency improvements. So you make the coal plant more efficient, you lower the variable cost, you have less coal burn for the same output, and you see it's a little cheaper. It's about $200,000 a year cheaper, and it generates much less CO2. That's good. But the big step is when you go to the bottom left, the blue or the green? The blue or the green. What are we doing in the blue ball? The blue ball assumes you upgrade 55 gigawatts of coal plants to be flexible. So what we assume here is we do capital investments on coal plants, 55 gigawatts, that's a lot, okay, to make them run at a technical minimum of 40%. We believe it can be even lower, but we assume for this analysis 40%. You upgrade them, run at 40%. Now, what do? You upgrade low efficiency, higher cost plants, because you're going to upgrade subcritical plants, typically far from mines, close to load centers, 200 megawatt, 250 megawatt, some 500 megawatt plants. Okay? You upgrade them. You run them less. You run them less because they're expensive and they're highly emitting. Okay? Instead, you run your more efficient, cheaper plants that are at mines more. So you change your operating regime. You change your operating regime to run your high efficient, lower cost plants more. You make your less efficient plants flexible to dispatch when needed in renewables. If you do that, and we were surprised at the output of this analysis, to be honest, this is $3+ billion of savings. $3+ billion a year of savings in the energy power generation ecosystem. It's real money. It is real money that this sector needs. At the same time, I'm sure exciting to everyone in this room and same to me, because everyone asks me, Andy, why do you build coal plants? Look what happens. Okay, you can't say anymore. The bottom axis is CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions are reduced drastically by changing the operating regime of the plants to run high-efficient plants more, low-efficient plants less. This is our supposition. This is what GE Power India deeply believes is the future for this sector, both in the sense of enabling renewable adoption in the country, which we're completely supportive of, but more importantly, and or at least more importantly for our world, in the thermal sector, is revitalizing it to be a more relevant part of India's energy future. I just want to wrap up and say I would just ask people in this room who have incredibly important voices in our sector and the way we drive policy and the way we think about all of our fuel mixes, I would ask you not to give up on thermal. I would ask you to demand it changes. I would ask you to demand some more forward thinking from the leaders of the sector, but don't give up on it. It's a highly relevant part of our ecosystem. It can drive lower cost than our power generation sources, which is important, and it can drive significant renewable adoption as well as less CO2 from its own generation. Thank you very much.